He was mocked for touching a rich kid's piano, but when his fingers hit the keys, the entire room froze. Elijah Brooks didn't talk much, not because he was shy. He just didn't see the point in filling the air when no one seemed to listen anyway. He lived on the west side of Baton Rouge, near Florida Boulevard, in a cramped two-bedroom apartment where the walls were thin and the neighbors louder than they needed to be. His mom, Charlene, worked double shifts at a local clinic, and his older brother, Isaiah, spent most of his time with a crowd Elijah didn't trust. But Elijah? He had music. Not a fancy piano or some state-of-the-art setup, just an old beat-up keyboard at the rec center down the street. Half the keys didn't work, and the cord sparked if you moved it the wrong way. But to Elijah, it was enough. Every afternoon after school, he'd rush over, fingers itching to play. No sheet music, no lessons, just sounds he carried in his head and heart. He played what he felt, sometimes joy, sometimes anger, sometimes silence. No one had taught him, but some things don't need teaching. They just come. At school, Elijah kept his head down. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he wasn't a standout either. Teachers often missed the way he tapped rhythms with his pencil during math, or the way his eyes lit up when the morning announcements played the school anthem. Most of the kids didn't notice him, except when they wanted to borrow answers or pick someone easy to tease. His one real escape came from Ms. Delacroix, his music teacher at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle. She was the only adult who seemed to see him for more than his quiet. She'd catch him humming during lunch, pull him aside after class, and ask him questions that made him think. About chords, scales, how to tell a story with your hands instead of your mouth. "You hear the world different than most people, Elijah," she told him once, after he improvised a lullaby for a pretend baby assignment. "Don't ever let that go." He didn't plan to. Then one Thursday morning, just before spring break, the school announced a joint event with Bayside Prep, an elite private school across town. It was billed as a community arts exchange, which meant Elijah's class would spend a day attending workshops and watching student performances at the other school. Most kids groaned. Elijah sat up straight. Bayside Prep. He'd heard of it. Big lawns, uniforms, a cafeteria that served sushi. Rumor was their music department had a baby grand in every room. Elijah couldn't picture that. He'd never touched a real piano before. He'd seen one once, though, at the downtown concert hall when his class got free tickets to the Philharmonic. It gleamed under the stage lights like something out of a dream. He didn't hear most of that concert. He was too busy watching the pianist's hands. Now he had a chance to see it for himself. Maybe even play one, if no one was looking. Charlene ironed his best shirt the night before the trip, even though it had a small stain near the cuff. "You behave," she said, not looking up from the ironing board. "Don't go embarrassing me in front of those people." "I won't." "Don't touch nothing you're not supposed to." He nodded. He meant it too. But music had a way of making him forget rules. But Elijah had no idea how much one mistake, or maybe one moment of courage, was about to change everything. The bus ride to Bayside Prep was only 30 minutes, but it felt like Elijah had stepped into another planet. As the bus pulled through the iron gates, he stared out the window at rows of perfectly trimmed hedges, fountains that actually worked, and buildings that looked more like museums than classrooms. Kids in matching navy blazers stood in groups, laughing the way people do when they don't have to think about what might happen tomorrow. Everything seemed too clean, too still. Even the sidewalks felt expensive. Elijah followed his classmates off the bus, gripping the strap of his backpack. He didn't say much, just took in the sight of a courtyard with a bronze statue in the center, some founder with a scroll in one hand and a smug grin carved into his face. Inside, the floors shined like glass. The hallways smelled like lemon polish and fresh paper. No graffiti, no cracked tiles, no teachers yelling from down the hall. Just quiet confidence. He walked with the group past displays of student art framed like it belonged in a gallery. One piece had an actual price tag, $200. Elijah stared. He could draw too, but no one had ever offered to buy his sketches. They were herded into an auditorium where the Bayside students were already seated in neat rows. An older man with silver hair welcomed them with the same voice people use at church. He said a few things about unity and creative expression and called the event a celebration of talent from all backgrounds. Elijah looked around and counted. Out of everyone in the room, he was one of maybe 5 black students. Most of the Bayside kids looked like they'd never missed a meal, never been told not today, never had to wait until Friday for new socks. They watched a short performance by the Bayside Jazz Ensemble. It was good, clean, practiced, even impressive, but something about it felt rehearsed in a way that made Elijah's chest tighten. Not because he wasn't good enough, because he knew he was, but no one here would believe that unless he proved it. They split into breakout sessions. Elijah was assigned to a songwriting workshop in room 208. He walked there with a group of kids he didn't know, staying quiet while others made jokes about cafeteria food and whose Tesla their parents drove. Room 208 was a music room, all right, but not like the one back home. This one had floor-to-ceiling windows, soundproof walls, and instruments lined up like soldiers, guitars, violins, a cello in the corner. But what caught Elijah's eye was the piano, a gleaming black Steinway Grand, bigger than any instrument he'd ever touched. The lid was open, the keys polished like bone. The instructor hadn't arrived yet, and most of the kids took seats without much interest. Elijah didn't. He stood by the wall, eyes locked on the piano like it was daring him. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Don't even think about it." He turned. A tall boy with slicked-back blonde hair was staring at him, flanked by 2 others who looked like they practiced scowling in the mirror. The tall one was wearing a monogrammed blazer, PJW stitched on the chest. "That's my dad's donation," the boy added. "You got anything like that in your neighborhood?" Elijah blinked, unsure if the kid was being serious or just trying to get a reaction. "I wasn't going to break it." "You sure about that?" The boy smirked. "Careful, those keys aren't made for dirty fingers." The words hit like a slap. The room got quieter. A few other students turned to watch. Elijah felt heat rise to his ears, but he didn't move. His hands stayed at his sides. The piano seemed farther away now, like it had shifted into another dimension. Part of him wanted to walk out. Another part wanted to speak, but he didn't trust his voice to come out steady. But then someone behind him laughed, and that was all it took for something inside Elijah to change. Elijah didn't remember making the decision. 1 second he was standing still, cheeks hot and heart pounding, and the next he was walking, toward the piano. The smirk on the blonde boy's face cracked just slightly. His buddies exchanged a look like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Elijah didn't flinch. He pulled the bench out with both hands and sat down slowly, like he had all the time in the world. His palms were damp, his throat dry, but his fingers didn't shake. The room was still, not silent, but still, like a breath held too long. The instructor hadn't come in yet. Maybe that was a blessing. Maybe it was fate. Elijah raised his hands above the keys. Then he hesitated. Because this wasn't the busted keyboard from the rec center. This was real. This was weight. This was sound that carried and echoed and filled a room. Not because of volume, but because of presence. He could feel every eye on his back. He could hear Preston's voice echoing inside his head, dirty fingers, like his skin had somehow stained the air. He took one more breath and pressed the first key, a simple C. Soft. Clean. It rang out like it had been waiting for him. Then came an E. Then G. He built the chord the way he always did, by feel. No one told him how, and no one had to. Music was the only thing that ever made sense without needing to be explained. He let his left hand follow, walking bass notes, gentle at first, then stronger. Then the right hand returned, weaving a melody over the rhythm, something familiar but unfinished. It was the tune he always played to himself when he was alone, the one he'd never named because it felt too personal, a song that didn't need words to say what he couldn't. The room began to shift. Conversations stopped. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. The two boys who stood behind Preston no longer looked amused. They looked confused. Preston didn't speak, but his mouth tightened. And Elijah, he didn't even notice anymore. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for the nights he spent alone in his room, listening to the sounds of his city outside his window. He was playing for the Sundays when his mother swayed to gospel at church, eyes closed, face soft for once. He was playing for the version of himself that had never been told, "Don't touch that." The music swelled. His hands flew faster now, confident and sharp. It wasn't perfect. He missed a note, stumbled on a chord, but it didn't matter. It was raw, alive, the kind of playing that didn't ask permission. When he stopped, the room didn't react right away. There was a pause, the kind that usually follows a punch in the gut. Then a girl near the back let out a soft, "Whoa!" Another student clapped. A few others joined. Preston didn't move. His hands were clenched at his sides. "That wasn't bad," one of his friends muttered, but Elijah heard something else in his voice. It was respect. The door creaked open. The instructor finally walked in, holding a clipboard. She paused mid-step, looking from Elijah to the stunned class. "Did I miss something?" she asked. A kid near the front nodded slowly. "Yeah, you did." Elijah stood up, slowly pushing the bench back into place. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. For once, the silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. But just as Elijah thought it was over, he turned and found something waiting for him in the hallway that he hadn't expected at all. Elijah stepped into the hallway, his chest still tight from the adrenaline, unsure whether to feel proud or afraid. He hadn't planned to play. He hadn't even known if he could, but he did. And now everything felt different. That's when he saw them. A small crowd had gathered outside the music room. Students from other workshops, a few teachers, all drawn by the sound. Some looked curious, others surprised, a few even impressed. But the one face Elijah locked onto immediately was Ms. Delacroix's. She stood near the back, her hand covering her mouth, not in shock, but in something else. Something softer. Her eyes shone in a way that made Elijah look down for a second. She walked toward him, slowly. "You really played that?" she asked gently. He nodded. "That was yours? That music?" He nodded again, almost afraid to say it out loud. She looked past him into the room, then back at him. "Elijah, that wasn't just good. That was something people remember." He didn't know what to say. He hadn't thought about being remembered. He just wanted to touch the keys, hear what they sounded like when played without fear. Another teacher approached, someone he didn't recognize. A tall woman in a grey blazer, clipboard tucked under her arm. She bent slightly to meet him at eye level. "I'm Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "I run the advanced music program here. I heard you from down the hall." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't seem to mind. "Have you ever taken lessons?" He shook his head. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Just practicing," he said. "I play at the rec center sometimes, and at home, when my brother lets me use his headphones." She smiled. "Well, you've got something special. That kind of ear, that kind of expression, you don't teach that. You guide it, you nurture it." Behind her, Preston finally emerged from the classroom, his blazer crumpled from leaning against the wall too long. He scanned the crowd, then focused on Elijah. Their eyes met, but neither said a word. One of Preston's friends whispered something and laughed, but Preston didn't respond. His face was hard to read now. Not angry, not smug, just unsure. Ms. Delacroix stepped in. "Elijah, how would you feel about playing something at the final performance this afternoon?" He looked up sharply. "Me?" "Yes, they always leave space for one guest student to share something at the closing. No, I know you should do it." He looked at the floor, then at Mrs. Caldwell, then back to Ms. Delacroix. A wave of nerves hit him like a second punch. Performing once in a classroom was one thing. Playing in front of the whole auditorium? "I don't know," he muttered. You don't have to, Ms. Delacroix said gently. But I think you'll regret it if you don't. He knew she was right. He nodded, slowly. Okay. The teachers began to scatter, the hallway clearing, the moment folding back into the day. Elijah followed Ms. Delacroix as she led him toward the performance hall, his steps slow, the hallway impossibly long. But something inside him was different now. It wasn't confidence, not exactly. It was closer to certainty. Like when a song plays and you already know where the notes go, even if you've never heard it before. Preston stayed behind, alone near the doorway. Elijah, he said quietly. Elijah turned. Preston looked like he wanted to say something, maybe to take back what he said earlier, maybe to act like none of it happened, but instead he just gave the smallest shrug and turned away. But as Elijah entered the auditorium later that day, he had no idea who else would be watching from the shadows, and how deeply his performance would echo beyond that room. The auditorium was brighter than Elijah remembered. He stood behind the curtain, heart pounding, staring at the polished stage floor. Rows of chairs stretched out beyond the stage, already half filled. Students shuffled in with snacks and programs, joking and scrolling on their phones. A few teachers stood near the back, chatting in low voices. Everything looked casual, except to Elijah. He was wearing the same wrinkled shirt from that morning, sweat beginning to darken the collar. His fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear of playing. He trusted his hands. It was the crowd, the unfamiliar eyes, the weight of being seen. Ms. Delacroix appeared beside him, her voice low. They're going to love you. What if I mess up? He asked. You won't, and even if you do, they'll still feel it. That helped. A little. The student announcer, a tall girl with thick glasses and a polished voice, introduced the event's closing performance. We'd like to welcome a guest student from Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, Elijah Brooks, with an original piano piece. Polite applause. Elijah stepped out. He didn't look at the crowd, just focused on the piano, waiting at center stage. It gleamed under the lights, same as before, like it knew him now. He sat, took one breath, let his fingers find their home, and he played. It wasn't the same melody as earlier. This one was slower, quieter, more patient, like a letter written out loud. It started with the kind of ache you can't name, something in the pauses between notes, the way certain chords hung longer than they should. Then it shifted, grew warmer, braver, like something fighting to stand on its own feet. Every measure told a piece of him. The nights alone in his room, the sound of his mother praying in the kitchen when she thought he was asleep, the way the rec center keyboard sparked sometimes but never stopped working. The room stilled. Even the faculty stopped whispering. Phones lowered, eyes lifted, and somewhere in the second half, the emotion behind his notes caught up to him. His chest clenched, his eyes stung, but his hands didn't falter. He played all the way through. When the last note faded, he lifted his hand slowly, like releasing something heavy. Silence. Then a single clap. Then another. Then the whole room. A standing ovation didn't happen. This wasn't a movie. But the applause was real. Full. Some students stood. One teacher wiped her eye. Even the announcer looked surprised. Elijah stood, bowed without thinking, then walked off stage fast before the crowd could catch him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Then a voice. That was incredible. He turned. Preston. His blazer was buttoned now, hair a little neater. But the cockiness was gone. He wasn't flanked by friends this time. I didn't know you could do all that, he said. Elijah said nothing. Preston shifted. What I said earlier. I was out of line. Still, Elijah didn't speak. I guess I just didn't expect it. Elijah looked at him, then said quietly, You didn't have to. Preston nodded once. Yeah, and that was it. No big moment, no handshake, just an awkward pause and two boys standing in a hallway too big for either of them. Ms. Delacroix came out smiling. You did it. He managed a breathless laugh. I think I did. She looked at him for a long second. "Let's talk later. There's someone I want you to meet." But what Elijah didn't know was that someone in the crowd had already made a call, one that would open a door he never imagined he could walk through. By the time the bus pulled back into the parking lot of Martin Luther King Jr. Middle, the sky was streaked with gold. Elijah sat near the back, forehead resting against the window, watching Baton Rouge roll by in pieces. Fast food signs, gas stations, corner stores. Familiar again. Comfortable, but smaller now. He hadn't said much on the ride. Some classmates gave him high fives. A few asked how he learned to play like that. One boy, Jamari, even joked, "Bro, you made rich kids clap. That's magic." Elijah had smiled, but inside, everything still buzzed. Not nerves, not fear. Something else he didn't have a word for yet. Ms. Delacroix waited at the bottom step as students climbed off the bus. "Elijah," she said, pulling him aside gently. "That woman I introduced you to, Mrs. Caldwell, she wants to see you again." He blinked. "Why?" "She runs a summer arts program, scholarship-based. She said it's rare to find someone like you who hasn't been formally trained." He looked down at his sneakers, the left one scuffed. "I don't have money for lessons." "That's the point," Ms. Delacroix said. "You wouldn't need any. Everything's covered. You just have to show up. And play." Elijah didn't know what to say. Opportunities like that didn't come to kids like him, not without strings. "I told her I'd talk to your mom," she added. "She'll want to know." That night, at home, Charlene stood in the kitchen holding the brochure in one hand and a half-burnt grilled cheese in the other. Her face didn't say much, but her silence was loud. "They're not trying to use him for anything?" she finally asked. "No, ma'am," Ms. Delacroix said from the other side of the table. "It's a real opportunity. They've done this for students across the state." Charlene looked over the paper again. "And he'd stay where?" "In dorms, supervised, Baton Rouge School for the Arts. Just a few weeks. He'd be home by the end of summer." Elijah sat on the edge of the couch, backpack still on. His fingers curled into the straps. His mother stared at him, not blinking. "You want this?" He met her eyes. "I think I do," she sighed. Deep. The kind of sigh she only made when her mind was traveling way ahead of her mouth. "He's 12, she said quietly. "Still a baby. I'll be careful," Elijah said, voice just above a whisper. "You better." She looked at Ms. Delacroix again. "I'll think on it." That was more than enough for now. A week later, the letter came. A white envelope with blue trim, his name typed neatly in the center. Inside was the formal offer. Elijah read it 3 times before handing it to his mom. She didn't say anything at first, just nodded, then handed it back without a word. He packed his things in a duffel bag that was too big for him. Ms. Delacroix drove him to the campus herself. On the way there, she told him about other kids who had gone through the program, some who had never even touched a real instrument before their first lesson, others who'd gone on to places like Juilliard and Berkeley. "But none of them sounded like you," she said. "And I mean that." The campus wasn't like Bayside. It wasn't shiny, it wasn't fancy, but it felt honest. The music building had paint chips on the windowsill, and benches worn smooth from years of waiting students. He liked that. His first day, he played in front of 3 instructors. They didn't ask where he came from. They asked what key he felt most at home in. He said D minor. They nodded like they understood. By the end of the first week, he'd written 3 new pieces. By the end of the second, he was teaching a classmate how to move through changes with feel instead of math. One evening, after dinner, his instructor sat beside him in the practice room. "You know what I told my husband after I heard you play?" she said. Elijah shook his head. That's what talent looks like when it's unafraid. But even with new keys in his hands and doors swinging open, Elijah still had one more thing to do before any of it felt real. It was October when Elijah walked back through the doors of Bayside Prep. This time, he didn't arrive on a school bus. No matching t-shirts, no field trip form in his backpack. He came alone, invited back by Mrs. Caldwell to perform at the annual fall recital. It was her idea, a surprise solo act from a student of the summer arts program, a way to show what raw talent could become with the right support. Elijah had grown a little taller since the spring. His jeans fit better, his curls were neater, and his hands had developed a quiet confidence. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. The auditorium looked just as he remembered it. Clean floors, bright lights. That stage. It didn't feel bigger than him anymore. In the front row sat Ms. Delacroix, her purse balanced on her lap, eyes shining with quiet pride. And next to her, Charlene, wearing her best blouse and clutching the edge of her seat like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She hadn't been sure about the performance at first. "I don't know what people like that want from kids like you," she had said. Elijah had answered simply, "Just to hear." Now here she was, waiting to hear. The MC gave a brief introduction. "Tonight's final performer is a young man who reminds us why music still matters. Please welcome Elijah Brooks." He walked out, not too fast, not too slow, just steady. The Steinway was there again, waiting. This time, he didn't hesitate. The piece he played was new, something he'd written 2 weeks earlier, inspired by his summer. It had no title, just movement. It started low, steady, like steps being counted. Then climbed, measure by measure, into something warmer, more certain. There were flourishes, yes, but nothing showy. Everything had purpose. Notes flowed like thoughts forming mid-sentence. Honest. True. Halfway through, he glanced up. Preston sat 3 rows back, arms folded, watching. They hadn't spoken since that hallway. But Elijah didn't need words. The silence between them now wasn't heavy. It was filled with understanding. When the final note hung in the air, Elijah held it just long enough for the breath in the room to catch. Then he lifted his hands. And this time, the applause came fast. Not polite. Not hesitant. Real. Charlene stood. She didn't clap at first, just stared at her son like she couldn't believe he was hers. Then, quietly, she smiled. After the show, people approached him. Teachers, parents, a few students. They asked about his music, where he learned. What came next? He answered as best he could, still uncomfortable with too much attention. But one moment stayed with him most. A small boy, maybe 9, skinny, with crooked glasses, walked up and whispered, "That made me want to try piano too." Elijah knelt slightly. "You should. I don't know how. Doesn't matter. Just start." The boy smiled. That was enough. Later, as they drove home, Charlene was quiet. "You okay?" Elijah asked. She nodded. "I just never thought I'd see something like that, not with your name on it." He looked out the window. The streetlights blurred past. "Neither did I," he said. "But maybe it was always there." She didn't answer, but her hand reached across the console and rested on his. That night, Elijah sat at home with a notebook in his lap. He wasn't writing music, just words, scattered thoughts, a line he wanted to remember. You don't have to be invited to be allowed. The world hadn't given him permission to sit at that piano. He'd taken it. Gently, honestly, fully. And in doing so, he'd reminded them and himself that talent doesn't care where you're from, what you wear, or how much your parents donated. It only cares that you listen to it when it calls. So if you're watching this and wondering whether you're good enough, whether you're allowed to try, here's your sign. You are. Now go do it.